Treating caregivers well, a shared responsibility. There are social phenomena that, while still very much present, are poorly documented because they fall into a blind spot. This is the case with the mistreatment of caregivers. The first action research carried out in the subject in Quebec has shed light on the sources of this mistreatment in all its forms and has led to the development of an awareness toolbox. This capsule presents the context for and the findings of the action research. Two other capsules are available in the toolbox we developed. One of these describes how to facilitate an awareness workshop. This capsule looks at the following points: the action research, review of the literature, participants in the research, main findings, and intervention toolbox for awareness and prevention of mistreatment of caregivers. First, the action research. For several years, the Regroupement des aidants naturels du Québec has been concerned about situations of mistreatment. In 2016, RANQ and the Carrefour des Proches Aidants de Québec asked Sophie Etier from University of Laval to explore this topic. In 2017, a World Café was held in Quebec with 27 caregivers, caseworkers, researchers, and students. In 2018, RANQ, Sophie Etier, and Marie Beaulieu from the University of Sherbrooke obtained a grant from the Quebec government through the Programme Québec Amis des Aînés to carry out an action research on this overlooked and poorly documented phenomenon, the mistreatment of elderly caregivers and of caregivers for the elderly. Finally, in 2021, the research project was completed and the awareness tools were launched. It is now up to you to write the rest of the story by using these tools. This action research was carried out in a partnership between academia and the community. Here are the members of the Project Orientation Committee. At the top row are members of the research team: Sophie Etier, head researcher, Marie Beaulieu, co-researcher, Anna Andrianova and Mireille Fortier, researchers, and representatives from the RANQ and its members: Mélanie Perroux, France Boisclair, Christiane Guibault, and Marie-Claude Gay. The overall objective of the research was to promote awareness of the mistreatment of elderly caregivers and caregivers for the elderly, with a view to disseminate knowledge and mobilize local and regional communities. In the framework of our research funded by the program Québec Amis des Aînés, we focused on two categories of caregivers. First, elderly caregivers, people aged 50 and older who are caring for a person of any age with a handicap. This could be a man aged 74 who is the caregiver for his wife of the same age, or a 53-year-old woman who is the caregiver for her adult child with mental health issues. The age of 50 was chosen by the organizations for the elderly, collaborating in the project, who have people 50 years of age and older as part of their clientele. This allows a larger number of caregivers to be targeted. Second, caregivers for the elderly. People of any age who are caring for a person aged 65 or older with a handicap. The age 65 was chosen as it is seen as the threshold for old age in Canada and in Quebec. Once again, this could be a man aged 74 who is the caregiver for his wife of the same age, or perhaps a 19-year-old granddaughter who cares for her 77-year-old grandfather. The specific objectives are the following: extend theoretical and empiric knowledge about mistreatment of elderly caregivers and caregivers for the elderly, develop avenues for recommendations aimed at preventing mistreatment and fostering the well-treatment of caregivers, design a facilitation tool that addresses caregivers and is used in the context of intervention. This action research is carried out in partnership, academia and the community, based on the principle of co-construction. This co-construction consists of two levels. First, together we construct knowledge about mistreatment of caregivers because it is still misunderstood and unrecognized. And together we also construct the awareness and prevention strategies that emerge. We focus on an approach involving the sharing of scientific, practical, and strategic knowledge, so this invites discussions and feedback. In order to carry out this research effectively, we used 4 methods of data collection. A review of the literature on the subject allowed us to analyze 53 documents, interview 15 mistreated caregivers individually, and convene 18 discussion groups. Finally, 3 regional consultation forums tested the tools developed following the data collection. At least 433 caregivers and caseworkers in 11 administrative regions in Quebec were mobilized in this research. Let's move on to the review of the literature. We searched 15 databases, which led us to 2,049 articles. Upon examining these articles, only 53 documents published between the years 2000 and 2018 were selected and analyzed. To begin with, we need to understand what constitutes mistreatment of caregivers. It was unlikely that scientific articles would name mistreatment. In the various studies, the authors do not use the term mistreatment when they talk about caregivers. The term is mostly used to talk about children and the elderly. For caregivers, the authors use related terms instead. For example, bad treatment, abuse, aggression, or violence. And the majority do not offer any definition of mistreatment. In these articles, mistreatment originates primarily from the person being cared for, who has either psychiatric issues, a cognitive illness like Alzheimer's disease, or perhaps a history of violent behavior. What is clear from this review is that the great majority of studies talk about mistreatment by certain types of people who are being cared for. However, it is not only these types of people being cared for who mistreat their caregivers. This merely shows that the studies focused on these types of people. We would like to put forward 4 other profiles. Adolescent grandchildren or adult children with dependency problems, behavioral or psychiatric issues. Spouses or parents with cognitive issues. Spouses who have perpetrated conjugal violence in the past. This violence continues or is reactivated in the context of aging of the couple or the change in relationship to that of caregiver person being cared for. And finally, parents who have previously mistreated their children. Once the children are adults and become caregivers of these parents, this violence returns in the context of the caregiver person being cared for relationship. We have not been able to compare the studies to extract a figure on the extent of mistreatment of caregivers. The studies each have different samples, methodologies, or objectives. For example, sometimes only the incidents of psychological abuse were studied, while in others just the physical abuse. On occasion, the study only focused on children with mental health issues. The sample in each study varied a lot and were often too small. Thus, according to the studies, 6% or 81% of caregivers had experienced mistreatment while carrying out their roles. This gap is far too wide to be able to draw a conclusion. None of the studies classified all the caregivers and all types of mistreatment. Thus, this information must be interpreted cautiously, but we need to remember that mistreatment of caregivers does exist. That is certain. We have not been able to compare the studies to extract a figure on the extent of mistreatment of caregivers. The studies each have different samples, methodologies, or objectives. For example, sometimes only the incidents of psychological abuse were studied, while in others just the physical abuse. On occasion, the study only focused on children with mental health issues. The samples in each study varied a lot and were often small. Thus, according to the studies, 6% or 81% of caregivers had experienced mistreatment while carrying out their roles. This gap is far too wide to be able to draw a conclusion. None of the studies classified all the caregivers and all the types of mistreatment. Thus, this information must be interpreted cautiously, but we need to remember that mistreatment of caregivers does exist. That is certain. Several risk factors were identified for a better understanding of mistreatment. Some of the risk factors are the same as those for mistreatment of the elderly, such as financial or physical dependence on the person being cared for, increased frequency of contact or coexistence, poor relationships, intergenerational transmission of violence, or social isolation. This is not new. These factors are some that increase the risk of the caregiver being mistreated. What interests us here are the risk factors associated with the caregiver person being cared for dyad. These risk factors are therefore specific to the caregivers and are in addition to those already known and mentioned previously. The literature shows that mistreatment could occur when the caregiver is perceived as controlling by the person being cared for example, because they insist on giving the person a certain medication or monitor the person. Also, when the caregiver who is paid to carry out the role, therefore the person being cared for has higher demands. Mistreatment can also result from an imbalance of power in the relationship. The person being cared for feels they have lost the power in this new relationship and becomes violent or makes hurtful comments. The person being cared for may also mistreat their caregiver when there are sudden changes in care methods or a routine, or when there is a lack of stimulation when care is provided poorly by the caregiver, or during placement in a care home. The literature highlighted the fact that mistreatment of caregivers comes essentially from the person being cared for. Types of mistreatment associated with the environment also exist. Here are some risk factors and examples of this context. Absence of adequate support to deal with behavioral changes in the person being cared for. Lack of psychological support services for caregivers. An absence of services, treatment, care programs, and general support for the person being cared for. As such, the fact of not helping or supporting caregivers appropriately while they carry out their role is also mistreatment, but this time it comes from the environment, institutions that are meant to help caregivers. Let's now take a look at data collection. We interviewed 15 mistreated caregivers individually. The average age was 61 and varied from 31 to 84 years old. 11 of the 15 were women. We noted that the caregivers interviewed were more educated than the average caregiver because 9 of the 15 had a university degree. We also met with 43 caseworkers from community organizations in 5 different regions of Quebec by means of discussion groups. 98% of these caseworkers are often or occasionally in contact with mistreated caregivers. The majority of them have between 1 and 5 years of experience working with caregivers, and 30% of them have over 6 years of experience. Here are the positions occupied by the caseworkers of the discussion groups. 17 of the 43 are caseworkers, and 11 are coordinators for their organizations. On average, caseworkers were 47 years old, and most of them had a university degree. Finally, we met with groups of caregivers, 13 groups in 11 regions of Quebec for a total of 95 participants, mostly women. There were 79 women and 16 men. The average age of caregivers was 69, but the age ranges from 35 to 93 years old. These caregivers in the discussion groups had a lower level of education than those we met individually, and are more representative of caregivers in the general population. 34% had a high school diploma, and 25% have a college diploma. In this next section, we will present the main findings of this data. Remember that the review of the literature showed us that mistreatment of caregivers comes mainly from the people being cared for. In our research, we identified 4 sources of mistreatment. Mistreatment originated largely within institutions through caseworkers or professionals. Next came the entourage, close contacts, family, friends, neighbors. Next, for those who mistreated the caregivers the most were the people being cared for, and to a lesser extent, the caregivers themselves. Different manifestations of the 4 main sources of mistreatment can be grouped into 7 categories. Each of these 4 sources may, in their own way and at any given time along the caregiver's journey, carry out mistreatment by using one or more of these forms: imposing the role and making the caregiver over-accountable, judging the way the caregiver does things, normalizing the role of the caregiver or the mistreatment experience while performing the role, denigrating the expertise of the caregiver and their familial and social contribution, denying the needs of the caregiver, using psychological, physical, or sexual violence towards the caregiver, and contributing to the impoverishment of the caregiver. Here are some concrete examples of how sources may use these different forms of mistreatment. First, examples from institutions of imposing the role of caregiver, denigrating their expertise and needs. You're so capable of looking after him, just get it done. When you go to talk to caseworkers, they feel threatened, accused, they want to get rid of you, or like at the end of the day, they don't pick up your calls and you can never meet with them. Ha! The tired one is like, here again. You're perceived like that. That's the way I see it. The more progress I make, the more I'm pushed aside. I heard some very inappropriate remarks you wouldn't normally make if you're ethical, like, why are you still doing it? Then you understand? Your husband won't come back. They would be very surprised to see what state he's in today. Here are some examples of imposing the role of caregiver, judging, denigrating the familial contribution made by the role, and denying needs, all coming from the entourage. They say, you're doing a great job, I wouldn't be able to do it. That basically means, don't ask me to help you. The others don't help you at all, they critique everything you do, they put you down. What are you complaining about? Everything seems fine. Sometimes we minimize our role so they think we don't need any help. Or if we do ask for help, they don't see the need. Here are a few examples of the normalization of the role of the caregiver, judgments or use of psychological violence by the person being cared for. It's when we offer the caregiver respite, but we can't because the person being cared for won't agree. They don't want anyone in the house apart from the spouse or the child, no strangers. No matter what we do, it's a bottomless pit, and whatever we do, it's never right. My experience has been with denigration. For me, it's a form of violence. This leads to frictions from time to time. Every week I'm told, "You're so fat, you need to look after yourself. Your teeth are crooked, you don't have much hair on your head, your scalp is showing." I've been looking after her for 40 years now. I'm there to help someone who belittles me, who is incapable of thanking me. And finally, even caregivers can mistreat themselves. Here are some examples of caregivers who deny their own needs or who contribute to their impoverishment. Sometimes the caregiver is nice, but sometimes she's out to lunch. She just lost 20 pounds. She doesn't do much for herself during the day. She really needs to like herself more. We didn't learn that when we were young. It's just our generation. We mistreat ourselves. We don't look after ourselves, certainly not our finances. We've been abandoned. We hardly have a life, few clothes. I don't even allow myself to go to the hairdresser, just in case I might need 20 bucks to get to the hospital in the middle of the night. And even if I'm tired, I'll just make a detour. I'll get gas just in case. We put ourselves in extreme conditions. We don't look after ourselves. It's almost as if we're mistreating ourselves. So here are the sources and forms of mistreatment. Everyone is capable of mistreating caregivers. Based on the findings from our research, we propose this definition of mistreatment of caregivers. Performing the role of caregiver carries with it the risk of mistreatment, which affects the caregiver. This mistreatment can come from institutions, the entourage, the person being cared for, or the caregiver themselves. Whether intentional or not, it manifests itself through the absence of appropriate action or an attitude or act that occurs once or more. The mistreatment of caregivers can take one or several of these forms and change over time, imposing the role of the caregiver and making them over-accountable, normalizing the role of caregiver or the mistreatment experienced while performing this role, judging the way the caregiver performs the role, denigrating the expertise of the caregiver and their familial and social contribution, denying the needs of the caregiver, using psychological, physical, or sexual violence towards the caregiver, and contributing to their impoverishment. Finally, our research has allowed us to propose a definition of well-treatment of caregivers. Well-treatment of caregivers is a comprehensive process of accompaniment. Its goal is to foster support for caregivers, listen to their needs, and value their contribution, their experience, and their skills on a day-to-day basis in order to prevent mistreatment. We will now quickly present the toolbox developed in this research. Another capsule will provide more details on how to use it. We have created a poster, a facilitation guide, and 3 leaflets adapted to different audiences: caseworkers, the entourage, and caregivers. In addition, 3 capsules, one of which you are currently listening to, form part of this toolbox. The poster is titled "Treating Caregivers Well, a Shared Responsibility." The idea is to think of caregiving as a journey during which mistreatment may be present. Therefore, we have to be mindful of the fact that not all caregivers are mistreated while performing their role. It's also important to be reminded that the mistreatment is perceived differently, depending on the people involved and the context of the mistreatment situation. Here we are seeking to bring awareness of the possibility of mistreatment. The guide will help you to facilitate an awareness workshop using the poster. The leaflets will be distributed to the participants. Another capsule will guide you in facilitating an awareness workshop on the mistreatment of caregivers using the poster and the leaflets. You can download the tools, the poster, the guide, and the pamphlets on the RANC website at www.ranc.qc.ca. It is now up to you to contribute to the good treatment of caregivers. Thank you for listening.